So on this episode of Through the Mist, I have the opportunity to speak with Adam from Adam Falls. He is an individual who saw one of my videos and decided to reach out to me via email in order to engage on a variety of topics. Well, one of them that we settled on was the problem of evil. And so I hope that through you watching this, you can see kind of some of the problems that traditional creedal Christianity faces with addressing the problem of evil, but also you can kind of see an atheist perspective, as well as how LDS theology kind of addresses this problem with, in my opinion, a satisfactory answer. And so, so Adam from Adam Falls, make sure you go check out his YouTube channel. I'll link it below. So the video is going to start off with just us getting right into the problem and whatnot. But thank you for coming on, and I hope we can help answer this problem for you.
I think we threw out maybe discussing the problem of evil and kind of an LDS, how Latter-day Saints may approach that versus traditional Christianity. I don't know if that's something you want to discuss, or
yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to propose the problem?
Sure.
So The problem of evil is, if God is good and all-powerful, why is there so much unjust suffering, especially in children or animals? Either he cannot stop it or he won't, and in both cases seems unworthy of worship. And so I think that's the approach that we've seen on the online with what I would say the new emerging atheist community, more particularly Alex O'Connor. He's the most recent one of the more popularized atheists online now. And that is one of the instances or questions he likes to pose to Christians, is more specifically with animals, the unjust suffering of animals, or the suffering of animals that brings about no added purpose. And so that's what we will be talking about today.
Yeah. And I think that was one of, when I was out kind of the atheist phase for several years, agnostic after that, of course, that was one of the things I honed in on, was animal suffering, because that's a lot harder to answer, So, and I know Alex O'Connor had a recent Jubilee discussion, and that was part of that discussion. And Jacob Hansen was part of that, who's a LDS apologist. He's more straight apologist flavor. Which I think is good. You need those people. But that was one of the questions he posed to him, was part of that, at least, was problem of evil was animal suffering. And, it's a difficult question to tackle. And I do think the conception in Latter-day Saint scripture does allow for animal suffering. My feeling is it does explain that pretty well. But there are some, unanswered questions. I still think, even in the LDS conception, and I think we'll look into that. I also want to caveat the discussion that, sometimes this kind of discussion is a little unsettling for some people. If you're not totally open to challenging ideas or discussions, I often say it's better just to stay with what you know, and if it's good and beautiful and true and it's helping you, it's not necessary for you to tackle all these kind of challenging philosophical ideas. So if that describes you, feel free to not watch further, but not that my purpose is not to deconstruct anything. I'm kind of the position that there's so much goodness in the LDS faith, even though I actually still struggle with the concept of God and Jesus in the traditional sense. It's not like I've totally resolved every question I have about that. But I think, in this discussion, we can actually see, maybe this would be a bridge actually to one of my favorite authors, and that's Fyodor Dostoevsky. I don't know if you've read any of his works. If you haven't, I would definitely recommend it. Famous ones are like Crime and Punishment and Brothers Karamazov. And Brothers Karamazov is probably the greatest discussion that I know of in Western literature of the problem of evil in a novel form. A huge amount of it is discussing that, but in a novel form, so it flows nicely and it's nice to read. And he was he was an Orthodox, so Eastern Orthodox from Russia, and he wrote in the 19th century. So interesting that the problems of atheism and the problem of evil are not new. In fact, he wrote several of his novels in reaction to the large portion of the intelligentsia and upper class leaving the Orthodox Church, precisely for the same reason I might have left 20 years ago. So the new atheist arguments are not new. The problem of evil is not a new thing, and so he actually wrote this book as a response to the issues brought up around this issue. And so it was seen to be a main topic of the time, especially in the 1840s and 1850s in Russia. Now, I would kind of like to just talk a tiny bit about Brothers Karamazov, which is his most famous book that discusses that. In fact, there's several chapters of the book that are build in the problem of evil and then kind of a response. But the response is not what you would normally think. So that's where I think all Christians and Latter-day Saints can look for a potential way to address it. But in one of the chapters of the Brothers Karamazov is called The Grand Inquisitor. And in this, there's a character, one of the brothers, Ivan Karamazov, and he's the classic atheist. So he presents situations to his other brother, and what he does is he outlines all these examples of suffering, and he focuses on innocent children, of course, so young children. And his brother's name is Alyosha, and Alyosha is kind of the innocent, happy-go-lucky, believes in God and is kind of a Orthodox and do-gooder and stuff like that. Very nice to everybody and a good-natured person. But this Ivan is kind of a cantankerous, kind of does what he wants. He's kind of about pleasure seeking, and there's no moral rules and stuff like that. Kind of like what we would see these days. And in this description, he gives one example of a suffering of a young boy who's actually given by his mother, whose mother is trying to get out of trouble with her, basically the general landlord. And she gives up her son, and this general essentially sicks his dogs on the kid and tears him to shreds. Now, interestingly, you might think that these are just totally made up. Actually, these were newspaper headlines that Dostoevsky used to create these scenarios. So he actually borrowed newspaper headlines of the day. And apparently this was one of them, that some landlord general in the area had just, for fun, had his dogs tear in front of his mother's eyes, tear his kid apart. Ivan's argument against God is that, how can, of course, God, if it's a just and good and loving God, and Jesus always characterized God as a loving father, a fatherly figure, like, I have 4 kids. So, if I had loving kids, how would I approach my kids? And if the moral universe that I have as a father is different than God's, if God's way of handling things is somehow different than mine, then how does that compute? And so there's kind of a famous quote. It's a little challenging to understand, but I'll just quote it here. He says, "I understand, of course, what an upheaval of the universe it will be when everything in heaven and earth blends in one hymn of praise, and everything that lives and has lived cries aloud, quote, 'Thou art just, O Lord, for thy ways are revealed.' When the mother embraces the fiend who threw her child to the dogs, and all 3 cry aloud with tears, quote, 'Thou art just, O Lord,' then, of course, the crown of knowledge will be reached and all will be made clear. But what pulls me up here is that I cannot accept that harmony." So he's laying a difficult scenario where any of those parties will, if they're believers, would say God is a just God, and he can't make that jump. He can't say, well, that is indeed just. So I think that, if you read the whole, the novel, it's an exquisite novel. The problem of evil is just part of it. And you'll get a more depth review of that. Now, I thought it might be interesting to just kind of look at the classical problem of evil. Maybe that I'm not an expert moral philosopher by any means, but maybe review some of the classical issues with the problem of evil. I think, as you outlined, the main problem is that if you believe in an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, all-loving God, and then you run into two potential issues. One is the logical problem of evil, and that could be that if God is those things, he could prevent evil. If he's omniscient, he knows about all potential evils, and he could stop them beforehand. And if he's omnibenevolent or all-loving, he could just eliminate evil. Yet evil still exists. So therefore, that if there was a logic there, you would say God cannot exist, right? There's also another way to say, well, maybe we can't by logic rule it out. That's the evidential problem of evil. But the amount, so the degree of suffering is the problem. And this is a big challenge. So I think to all Christians, even Latter-day Saints, is the amount and nature of evil makes it improbable that all powerful, all knowing, all good God exists. So I think it kind of useful to go through some of the standard Christian responses to the problem of evil, because we use some of the same ones. So, and some of that's in LDS theology, of course. We're not totally dissimilar. First one is a pretty common one. That's the free will defense. This is something you'll definitely see Latter-day Saints go to. And there's a philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, who actually know from the Christian Reformed tradition. Actually, the pastor I mentioned earlier, Paul Vanderklay, is from the Christian Reformed Church. Alvin Plantinga was a philosopher in that tradition. He was a teacher at Calvin Seminary, which is one of their training schools. And so I've read some of his writings, but he's one of the foremost defenders of the free will defense. Of course, that God allows evil because he gives humans free will, which is necessary for genuine love, a moral responsibility, and meaningful relationships. So we have to, in order to have free will, you have to have the ability to choose evil. And there's, of course, many scriptures in the LDS canon that support this. You have to have opposition in all things, right? We kind of know from the Book of Mormon. So I do think this is a key component of LDS theology that cannot escape the free will part of things. And so really the key points is God creates beings with free will, and can't guarantee that they always choose good. So and a natural consequence of that is they're sometimes going to choose evil. And some of the critiques of the free will thing are obviously the animal suffering. So this is not explaining animal suffering. We don't think they have free will in the same way we do. And natural evil. So that doesn't explain how the earth reacts in certain ways. So natural disasters, for example, don't have anything to do with our free will. So couldn't God create less suffering through controlling, things that are not related to human free will? So it's pretty clearly a thing that could challenge that. Then another way to look at from a Christian standpoint is, and this is definitely huge in LDS theology, is soul-making theodicy. So I like what John Hicks talks about it. And the purpose of life is not immediate happiness, but the development of moral and spiritual character. So, quote, soul-making, right? So evil and suffering provide opportunities for humans to grow, and virtues like courage, compassion, perseverance. And of course, in LDS theology, we would take that much further. We would say we become like God. We're of the same kind as God. And I like the word that the Orthodox use as theosis. So they more understand that word, which is we become like God in a certain sense. We become one with God. Now, they would not say that it's maybe
not ontologically the same.
Not ontologically the same,
Yeah.
But we would say, and I think this is supported, Paul supports this, that we become joint heirs with Christ. And that's literally true, right? Or the possibility that's literally
Yeah.
true. It's not that we do that of our own creation. Of course, we're still dependent on God and Jesus. I think that's where the contention comes in. Is a lot of people that critique LDS beliefs will say we're making ourselves God. We have the power to do that. Of course, we can barely tie our shoes in the morning, most of us. So it's still through God and Jesus that that's happening. But that they, if they really are loving parents, they would want us to have all they have, and so that process. So a soul making theodicy is extremely developed, way more developed in LDS theology.
Yeah.
Um,
I would actually argue that I have rarely encountered Christians that believe that that is the purpose of life.
yes,
So I
I
think
would
that's
agree.
almost a novelty in some Christian spheres. It might not be, but even in like Eastern Orthodox, who heavily rely on the idea or the doctrine of theosis, like even then, when you press them on what that actually means, it does sound a lot like most Protestant Christians' understanding of the purpose of life in some sense.
Yeah,
Because what does it mean to become like God if you're not ontologically the same as God? And what is the purpose of you becoming like God? I mean, what is the purpose of you becoming a joint heir with Christ, even in the next life? Like, what does that really entail? And most Christians won't be able to say much aside from to glorify God. Which
yes, yeah,
we would also agree that like our exaltation, of course, brings glory to God. Um, but I think
yeah,
I think before we jump into the kind of the Christian answers or even kind of critiquing anything or critiquing any of their positions, I think it would be good to note the fact that Christians also have some underlying presuppositions that kind of, I would say, hamstring them into uh, a corner that I think is really hard to find their way out of. One of those is creation out of nothing. And so, with the idea of
yeah,
creation out of nothing, that in and of itself would cause the issue of, well, if um, who created evil, or who created the option for there to be a choice between good or not good, which I think most Christians that you speak to, when they're describing what evil would just be the absence of doing the good thing. And the good thing is what God deems is good. And so there's the creation out of nothing, which is a big problem. They also don't believe in a premortal existence, which is also, I can't even begin to explain. Like, when you speak to a Christian, they will say that they have the ability to choose. Some of them will say that, like you said, free will. But one choice that they don't believe that they ever had was to enter into mortality. So that was forced upon them. And so that idea, coupled with the idea of original sin, or the Augustinian form, which would be like more original guilt, it couples the idea that you were never free to even choose to enter into this experience at all, which once again elevates the problem of evil, because now God's putting you in this position where you didn't actually make a decision to be created, and now you're in this situation where you can suffer. And for most of humanity, because they don't accept Jesus Christ, they will suffer indefinitely unless you're an nihilist, in which case you'll cease to exist, which I think is a little bit more just if you believe in creation out of nothing.
yeah,
Personally, he just can
yeah,
uncreate you. And then also, our purpose of life is different. So our understanding, our framework of the reason why we're here is a lot different than Christians, I would say. And then also, um, uh, in most Christian, well, at least the most Christians I've spoken with, uh, they don't consider God or Jesus Christ to have suffered in the garden for our sins, which is something that
mhm,
I will concede we probably focus on a little bit too much in comparison, and put maybe a little bit too little emphasis on the cross. But their lack of placing emphasis on the suffering that took place in the garden, because they don't have additional scripture that would kind of clarify that's what happened there. Um, because of that, what exactly did God suffer? Did God actually suffer every possible thing that could be any type of suffering that could have happened in any person's life. And I would say for them, I mean, Jesus Christ was crucified, right, which is a very painful process. But is that every form of suffering that can be taken upon a human being? And I would say no. And so they would have to go outside their canon in order to say that God has suffered or experienced suffering in the same sense that we would know that he has. And the layperson, perhaps in the Christian faith tradition, might say, well, God is omniscient, so he knows all the suffering. But God doesn't have parts, passions. He can't experience, even with the hypostatic union, it was only the human nature of God that suffered and truly felt the pains of humanity in that sense, in that the human Jesus Christ, he suffered. The God or the divine Jesus Christ did not suffer, if that makes sense, which is a whole different problem with the atonement. But so there's all of this underlying presuppositions that I think kind of go into their issue with answering the problem of evil. And to be frank, I don't think that they have a good way to explain it at all. Like I can think of like a few different ways to kind of get past. I mean, I could just take the premortal existence. Like they didn't even have an opportunity to choose to enter into mortality. So
yeah, I concur. I don't think they have a good response. I read some Catholic authors. I really like Balthazar, for example. He's the one that I think I sent you a message about the ground of all being. So literally God is outside time and space, and he provides the foundation. It's hard to even contemplate this, but really, Paul said we live and move and have our being, and that's kind of the basis of that thought, that even the potentiality, the reality we have, he's kind of underneath that. And so, of course, the problem of evil then becomes more striking, because if you're the basis of all reality and you're outside of it, why aren't you doing something about it?
Exactly.
If you could literally do it so easily. And all the points you mentioned, I totally agree. I'm familiar with all that. And so I think it is, it's a hard thing. Don't want to underestimate that anybody is truly suffering and going through these incredible things, past or present, all over the world, that, we have some easy answer, and that person in that moment. I think all of us are going to struggle and mainly find ways to have compassion and show love towards those people, and not just throw out, hey, we believe, we chose it to come here or something, right? I don't think that's the proper mode, but I do think there are some better answers. So, yeah, you did mention Augustine, and he's one part of this. Is the Augustinian theodicy, where it's more like evil is a privation of good. So instead of it's just lack of being good.
Yes.
And then, so God created a good world, but we brought human evil into it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it's fallen. You've got, original guilt and sin. As you're talking about, which I
still believe that's a paradox in and of itself, because God can still create a scenario in which it is impossible to not accept him. And he chose not to create that. And so most Christians will say, well, he doesn't want to create robots, or like he wants to develop us. Well, why does he want to develop us? What is the purpose of him developing human beings? Like, God didn't need to create us in their framework. And then he did create us out of nothing, literally out of nothing. And all the world around us, the physics that hold up the universe, and some of the physics we don't even know, like, he created that. And so our view of the universe is so remotely different. Like, we believe that God is bound within eternal law, and these things already just exist. Everything has already existed, and he's just forming things, and he's progressing things, and he's creating order from chaos, which kind of ties into some Near Eastern type topics. But
Yeah,
I just,
Jordan Peterson topics. He's
yeah,
big into order and chaos.
yeah,
Yeah,
I love that because that is really
yeah,
a very Near Eastern way. I mean, like you talk to somebody who's maybe like a Jewish scholar and you talk about Genesis 1:1 or just Genesis 1 in general, and they're going to explain something completely different than you would if you were talking to like an evangelical or Protestant biblical scholar, because their understanding of the context in which Moses or whoever wrote the Genesis account would have understood what he was writing, or the people at that time, I think aligns a lot closer to what they've actually would have believed at that time. And a lot of it, I think, was adopted from other cultures around them. He kind of had this like
yeah,
chaotic matter, and from that, God is he's separating it and he's dividing it and he's forming things from this chaotic matter. He's bringing order to it, which you speak to any Christian and they're like, no, absolutely not.
yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think Terrell Givens puts it nicely when, if God created us just to give him glory, then are we really talking about a selfish God? Or we, there's a great cognitive science scientist, actually a colleague of Jordan Peterson at the University of Toronto, is John Vervaeke, and he interacts with a lot with Christians. He's not a believer. He's what he calls an anti-theist, or not, sorry, not anti-theist, but non-theist. Um, but he has a great view of Jesus. He calls him the sage of agape. And so if you have different sages of things, he's definitely the sage of
of
love,
love,
but
yeah,
not any type of love,
yeah,
not eros or other ones, but agape. And if God is really agape, which is an outpouring love, it's not consuming love. So that eros would be consuming, like I become one with you. I eat a piece of food, I become one with that food, right? And you're consumed with that food, the taste, the flavors, everything. But when it's agape, it's I'm getting nothing from it. That really is the atonement, right? To some degree,
selfless, yeah,
yeah. It's an outpouring, and if God the Father is really that as well, which he should be if they're one and the same, one in purpose, and if you're a Trinitarian, basically the same thing in some sense, then how is I've never understood how an agapic view of love could then become an erotic, where now you're consuming other people, right? They're giving you obeisance, and that's your whole purpose, is you want that feedback. You need that. Now, I'm going to be cautious here and not say that I'm not here to denigrate other Christians or say that maybe they have some nuance to that, but I know that a lot of the time it is to give glory to God, as if God, if he was an agapic, if that was the totality of what he was, I don't see how that computes. And I also think that the LDS version does make more sense of that. If God stood among, quote, intelligences or agentic creatures of some sort, that we don't understand really what that means totally, but and saw fit to, help them become like him by instituting laws and so forth. And that sounds more like agape to me, rather than just us worshiping him. Of course, we do honor and sustain and worship God. That doesn't take away from that. So, I kind of wanted to maybe go to one of the other next defense, which is, and this is a very common one, is the greater good defense. So this would be probably used in something like the case that Ivan brought up. Well, maybe somebody watched it. they saw how terrible this was when the dogs were consuming the kid, and they were spurned, pricked in their heart, and changed. So this argues that God allows specific issues because it lead to a greater good that could not be achieved without them. So, so there may be people around, or if your child is dying, maybe you as a parent are changed, and there's a greater good from you or people around you. Of course, this doesn't help when it's a solitary thing where nobody observes it, and doesn't help with animal suffering, definitely, right? So, and at least not for fellow animals. we might do something, but the gazelle is not. Fellow gazelles are not learning and developing probably, other than knowing to avoid the predators. So, So I think those are, some of the main ones. Of course, I think a common one you get from Christians is just a mystery, the mystery of divine will. We don't know, right? So a lot are just like, it's ultimately a mystery. God's, and I like how actually Terrell Gibbons says it's, we don't know. We just throw up our hands, and maybe God's moral universe is different than our moral universe. Maybe we're not the loving. We don't have a good idea what a loving father or mother should be. Maybe a real loving father, a mother, father, mother would totally do something completely opposite, right? And so God's omniscience is beyond ours. He's outside of space and time. Maybe sees the end from the beginning, and so forth. So you can kind of push on this angle a little bit, but I still think it's unsatisfying. Um, there's also in Catholic theology more like redemptive suffering. So they see suffering, or of course we have this, and generally in Christianity, suffering has redemptive value. So modeled after Christ's suffering. So it does provide us how we can be united with
Perspective.
Christ, and
Yeah.
yeah, in suffering like Him and so forth. Now that is again the problem with young children. I think is still the issue there. How do you, or people that don't have ability to make, even adults that don't have the cognitive ability would normally associate with moral development. So how is their suffering then helping them, so to speak? So I think, if you kind of look through biblical things, people, often Christians and Latter-day Saints, well, you could go to Job, look at his, that's basically a meditation on suffering,
Yeah.
um, and, Paul's teachings on suffering. Of course, he talks frequently about all the trials he's gone through. Of course, Jesus is suffering. And so you kind of have also an eschatological hope, the eschatology, I mean, what's going to happen in the future, what's the ultimate end of all things, is that God will ultimately defeat evil, restore creation, and will kind of give us all the answers in the end, so it's kind of like, we don't know, he's beyond us, and eventually in the eschaton, the end of all things, it'll be kind of revealed. And so I think those are some of the main ones that Christians try to respond. Did you have any other things you came across as to how do they try to
No,
respond?
I laughed when you said it's a mystery, because if you press enough, if you press far enough, it ultimately goes back to either God's sovereignty or a mystery. And so now, that being said, when we're talking about mysteries, well, what I'm talking about isn't what an Eastern Orthodox would say as far as like a revealed mystery. I'm talking about in the sense of like very much 21st century English, like it's mysterious. I don't know why, right? Essentially just saying I don't know. But from the Calvinist perspective, of course, you'll get God's total sovereignty. He does what he wills, right? And so why? Because God wills it, essentially. And so those are generally the two that I usually get. Although I will say, like, the problem of evil isn't really one that would come up very often. This topic, I think, if it were to ever come up, it would always be connected to the purpose of life for me. If I'm ever talking about this with a Christian, or the Protestant Christian or evangelical Christian. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I think, frankly, you avoid the subjects you don't have answers for,
yeah,
right? I think if anybody who's, of course, the atheists bring it up a ton, right? So
yeah, yeah, yeah,
they love this topic, right? Because it is really tough to answer, and it's easy to get somebody that believes in God to second guess themselves. That wasn't the reason I left originally, but it certainly became a component of that. It became difficult to return in some fashion, and I think in general, a lot of Christians, avoid some things, just like they would avoid like the 3 degrees that Paul talks about, or being baptized for the dead. Why is that scripture in there, right? You don't hear them talking about the Urim and Thummim, or the divining cup that
yeah.
Joseph of Egypt mentions in Genesis. they're going to avoid those things, and they'll think, "Oh, it's wacky that you're mentioning them." But I think if we're to be really, um, helping people return to church, a lot of people leaving, often they do start to ground some of that in these kind of issues. That,
Mm-hmm.
maybe they have suffering in their family, death
Yeah.
of a loved one, this kind of thing. And if we can't bring actual thoughts about it, or in a sophisticated way, not just browbeating people, why don't you just believe, this kind of thing? What's wrong with you? Then in this day and age, I don't think with the availability of obviously social media and these things everywhere, and specifically the LDS community, there's such an ex-Mormon, huge ex-Mormon communities. I don't know if there's any bigger communities than ex-Mormon communities, at least on YouTube and stuff. It's just some of the biggest channels out there in terms of religious content. And so if we can't deal meaningfully with these issues, I think that's when people leave. So now, I think I wanted, if we could, play a little clip of a Terrell Givens. He was actually on Mormonism with the Murph. I don't know if you followed him a little bit. And I don't know if you could pull that up, or you want me to kind
Yeah, you can
of share my screen?
Yeah, share screen.
Share my screen.
Yeah.
So I just have it pulled up here in just a short 3 minutes. And he's very eloquent, so he puts it so well.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can get this up a little bit. And we'll just play a short. So it's just like three minutes, I think, and that he'll kind of outline some of the things. I don't think he covers everything. I think there's more, but let's see what we hear here.
Agreed.
Says I don't.
Agreed.
So I think
Can you pause right there?
Within
sure, yeah.
So one of the things that that he's kind of pointing out is that because God is bound by things like the way physics works, right? That being said, there are certain things that I think that God knows that we don't know about some of these laws of physics and whatever's better than that. So I did pre-med in like a health science undergrad. And so I did zero physics. One of the classes that was required if I wanted to go to dental school was physics, but not like the math heavy physics or whatever. I didn't end up doing it, but I will say, like, if a tree falls on an animal, the tree is following the law of gravity when it is cut down or breaks or whatever, and it falls into the angle in which it's determined based off the laws of physics. If the animal happens to be underneath it, it's not that God felled the tree on the animal. It's that the animal was there and the tree had fallen. The same thing with a person walking off a cliff. Like, the cliff is there, gravity works, you walk off the cliff, you fall. And so that, I think, is like the kind of the way I view a portion of this problem. There's a problem of things happening to people, and then there's the problem of a tiger eats an antelope, or a lion eats an antelope, or somebody shoots another person. Like, that involves two things that are acting, or that can act, that are acting upon each other. Where I feel like a tree or something that might have intelligence doesn't really have the opportunity to choose. It has the difference between acting and being acted upon, essentially. But,
Yes.
So
yeah, I would agree with all that. You could say that what he's getting at, what Terrell is getting at, is that there are natural laws, and of course, if you believe some of that natural law could be, for example, evolution, to some degree. There's debate about the extent of that, I know, and certainly Latter-day Saints of different eras have disagreed about evolution and had a more fundamentalist approach to it. But I think at this juncture, most people concur that happens. And if you agree that that happens, then, and that's a natural law, then of course animal suffering could be a response to that, as that's just how things naturally develop in living systems. And so I think that's a possibility within the Latter-day Saint conception, because these laws are pre-existent. God did not ordain them or create them. So he did not create evolution out of nothing, such that it would then result in this animal suffering as a natural consequence. I think that is unique, and I like how Terrell puts it. And so, do you have any other thoughts, or you want to just finish?
No, yeah, please.
A little bit, maybe. Not too much more here. Yeah, so I think that's a little highlight of what we've been talking about. I think that's kind of summarizing it pretty well. And so just to kind of go further into that, some of the LDS responses, I guess he highlighted some very nicely. I think agency is in premortal agency, as you discussed, are key to that. So like he highlighted that we chose at some point to accept some sort of offer or plan from God. And we made that free choice. So, one of the thoughts is that there was some ability to understand what was going on. Of course, how could one completely understand something somebody hasn't experienced? Nobody's gonna know. Somebody could offer you to go on a roller coaster ride, and you kind of tell you what to expect, but of course you're not going to have full ability to comprehend that until you do it yourself. And I think that's just built into novelty experiences, novel experiences. So, but it's obvious that LDS theology has this duality between good and evil, and the evil exists, and it's it's present even in the premortal existence. So there was a group of people that chose one way and another, and there was enticement to choose one versus the other. And then, we believe in a eternal opposition in all things, and that's I can't see that changing. That seems like an eternal truth to me. In that agency predates human existence. So, like you said, he said there was war in heaven. You mentioned before that we had some agency, and we chose to come here.
So you're a medical doctor by profession?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the way I like to view it is, we could take your profession, for example. In undergrad, you had the opportunity to choose medical school. With that, you were explained, or an advanced PhD doctorate program, or graduate program. With that, people explain to you the cost of participating in that. There's, temporal cost, right? It's going to cost money. There was a time commitment, right? Whether it be 4 years plus the shortest, 4-year residency. So 8 years. Well, I don't know. Maybe the shortest is 3 years.
Yeah. 3 years is
emergency med is 3, right?
Family medicine, pediatrics.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's say the shortest, time commitment, 7 years. There's also going to be a lot of suffering by way of sleep deprivation, possibly. Perhaps your living conditions aren't going to be as good because you're having to pay for your way through school. And so your living conditions are going to be lessened. But you understood that going into it. So when you were in the experience, while it was unfortunate that you had to experience those things, what came out of it was you received further knowledge, and you received an accreditation or a certificate or a degree or something that demonstrates that you are separated from the people that chose not to do that. And that's why I think the premortal existence is so important to our theology, because without the premortal existence, there would have been no opportunity to say, I want to go to medical school, right? And so by profession, I'm in the Army, and one of the schools, so I'm in Special Forces. I'm a Special Forces medic. Yeah. But one of the schools I had the opportunity to go to was Combat Dive School, that's the Combat Dive. Actually, it's the Combat Dive Supervisor badge. And one of the things that's interesting about Combat Dive is, which I'll share this screen with you, is the school is really based, the school is 100% based on, at least the first 2 weeks, pain and suffering. And for the life of me, I could not understand, why is it that you needed to put us through this open circuit course, right? So this is just like scuba diving, open circuit. So you're breathing in the oxygen, you're blowing it out, and you can see the bubbles. Combat divers, or the type of diving that I do and I'm trained to do, is closed circuit. So there's a rebreather. So there's a canister that scrubs the CO2 out, right? It's and that's the main emphasis of the program. But the beginning, you do all this like really hard, arduous. They put you through a lot of suffering, and for the life of me, I could not understand it. Like, you're treating us. We've already been through this experience. We're already special forces. We've proven ourselves, but now you're going to put us through this kind of a hazing-ish. You treat us like we're nothing again, and kind of weed us out.
Is it kind of like buds? I always hear about buds with
Navy SEALs. A very similar, but condensed into 6 weeks.
Okay.
And so you do stuff like this, and it's meant to. So what it's meant to do is to remove people who cannot endure the pain and the agony that goes along, and the mental fatigue that goes along with this type of conditioning. And the reason being, and this entire course is meant to make you feel uncomfortable the entire time. What they have found previously was, when they made it a gentleman's course, or a course that was very professional, where, and I don't want to say professional because it was a very professional course, where gentleman course being more along the lines of, hey, you guys have to do this. It's very casual. What they found is a lot more people, because they weren't stress inoculated and they didn't self-select themselves out, there were actually more of a liability to not only themselves, but to the team. Because when you dive as a buddy team. So you dive on a line with somebody else. And that's for accountability and safety purposes. But then, even then, on a team, you dive 7, 8 to 12 people on a team line. And so if one person shoots up to the surface, the laws of physics, once again, you can have expansion of air in the lungs, which kind of separates out and goes through, and, bubble air to the brain and all that stuff. But so this entire course, they're nitpicking on all this stuff. People self-select out, but those who stay, they still continue to endure suffering throughout the entire course. But at the end of the course, when you receive that combat dive bubble, and you're counted amongst the peers of these people, and you receive this, you look back on that experience and say, all of that pain and suffering, it was temporary. It was very fleeting, and it happened, but I am a better person because of that. And so I would like to ask you, even by way of an infant who is before the age of accountability, which for the LDS faith tradition, that's 8 years old, even if they suffer, do you think that there's benefit to that?
Yeah, that's the tough question. I think, I think that is a thought within the LDS circles. It's certainly been, was it enough to get a body, right? You just need a body. That, I think that's unique to LDS attempts of this. There's obviously something to the phenomenal experience. There's once I listened to a discussion from somebody that was what he was as a counselor for people in end of life. Actually, that's all I did was hospice care. But he was more of, instead of taking care of the people, he was the one that would try to help people wade through it. And he was actually a Native American kind of healer type. This always stuck me. This is years later. He had this child that was dying of cancer, and his parents were, obviously very dismayed and distraught. And he went to the kid and asked him, "Hey, you're about to die. What would you tell your parents? What would you say?" And he says, "Well, I got to pet a horse once." In other words, that phenomenal experience, that life experience, was so magical. Even just the experience of life was in itself, at that young child's age, it wasn't, "Hey, I flew rockets to Mars. I became Elon Musk.
Yeah.
I became the CEO of this company. I made millions of dollars. It was just the experience of life, the magic of life. So I think there is something to that the, how much moral development, I think that's where the challenge is. If you believe it's a soul making theodicy, how much is in that. And, I think it's pretty clear to me that none of us are like Christ right now and will ever be before we die. So there has to be development, moral development beyond this life. I mean, that's clear. I mean, to think so would be kind of
relatively, once again, though, that's unique.
Yeah.
I would say that's unique to our theology, because I would say, especially when you're talking to a Calvinist, Christ's righteousness is imputed upon you, right?
That's true.
And so you become righteous like that, right? You're a piece of dung, and all of the perfect righteousness covers you like a perfect blanket, perfect white blanket. And that's not our theology.
Yeah. I can't do that, because as a physician or anybody who knows anything about development, or is become excellent, has expertise in anything. Let's say as a diver, you practice and you become a better diver. Your lung capacity goes up. Your ability to concentrate under tough conditions in darkness where you can't see and not panic, right?
Yeah.
Claustrophobia. There's all sorts of things. Cave divers, for example, it's not something you just go do in a pitch black environment with a rope. And
some do.
Some do, but it's not something they just do at the start, right?
Yeah.
These are experienced divers. I'm a pianist. I play the piano. If God imputed my ability to play like I was a robot and just kind of zapped me into it, well, have I really developed the ability to play that? No, I've just received a download, right? From the internet, and it's controlling. I'm essentially a puppet, right? So you'd be, in that sense, Pinocchio. The part of Pinocchio is that he wasn't a real boy, right? He was just controlled by the forces around him. Became a real boy when he made his own choices at some point and faced good and evil. He actually went to the underworld, the underbelly, and dark places, and rescued his father from the whale and stuff. And then when he developed that agency, he made choices, some bad, some good. Then he became his real person, but it was a developmental process. And so I think that in some sense, the child issue can be solved to some degree if you do allow for progression beyond the grade. And if you do believe their purpose is to become like God, then obviously that's where most everybody's going to be far from that at death. So that has to be a possibility. Now, I think you could criticize even the fact that we made premortal choices by saying, and I think this is a critique of LDS thought, is that why does it have to be as severe? Do we need the Holocaust to do this? Do we have to have the extreme suffering, that is out there, like torturing people and stuff, to get that same level of development or soul making or whatever it is? That's a fair criticism. Sometimes I don't have an answer to that. And so you can make that criticism. I think, we have obviously a belief in a limited divine omnipotence, which Terrell talked about there. And, that explains some of that, so unlike traditional Christianity, you've talked about God is not omnipotent in an absolute sense. So not creating ex-nihilo, like you mentioned, in controlling all aspects of reality. He's not the ground of being, like he's literally just putting his hands up and holding, like Atlas, the world, right? That's the picture I think of. And he's not the composer of the fundamental elements, so to speak. He's organizer, or in that sense. So you could put some of that that can be explained by that. And obviously we believe in agency and that God respects the agency of the intelligences, and so maybe this absolves God of some direct responsibility. I think that there's some critics like Karl Moser who say that limiting God's power doesn't fully resolve the problem. And this is, I think, where maybe there are some questions that can legitimately be asked and, thought over, is if God has shown the ability to intervene. So this is a problem for all Christians, including Latter-day Saints, and we believe that God intervenes in the real world. So it's not just that he's sitting back in a deist sense, he's following laws or gave initial instructions, maybe in the Garden of Eden, and then said, go to it. He's clearly, if you do believe in the Christian story, and including the Old Testament, and then obviously if you are LDS, you believe in the theophany experience of Joseph Smith, God is intervening in the real world at specific times and places.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think this is one of the harder things to answer, is if God is able to intervene at specific times, why is he not intervening at other times? Why does this person get to suffer and then the other? And of course, we have a strong belief in LDS culture that we can pray and receive answers and receive help, and that we do get answers and miracles do happen. And so this becomes difficult to say it's, why are things happening at one and why is it happening at another? And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that particular.
Well, so that's the thing, is so when I was in Key West for dive school, I'm a big lover of ice cream. So I love gelato.
Yeah, good stuff.
Have you had gelato from, you said you're Dallas? Do you guys have
I've had gelato in Italy.
Do you guys have, do you guys have like an Albertsons or Food Lion? Or,
Yeah,
okay.
Albertsons, yeah.
Okay, the Albertsons brand gelato ice cream. You've had it?
I don't think I have. Is it to die for? Is it good or?
No, it's probably absolutely horrid.
Oh, it's terrible.
It's probably nothing like gelato.
Yeah.
Right? But you've had gelato from Italy, right?
Yes.
Or you've had like real, like,
yes, there.
Like you've had nice
every day while we were there.
Yeah, yeah. You've had like really good gelato. You can make the comparison between the two. If I've only had Albertsons gelato, that is gelato. That is what it tastes like. If I only have Panda Express, that is the only thing I can. That is Chinese food. I've never been to China. That is Chinese food. I never tasted any different. I think that with increased suffering or increased contrast to things, like if the world around me is super evil and I choose to not be in the world and I choose God over that, I have such a stark contrast to make the comparison to, compared to somebody who potentially is just, and I don't want to say Utah is not clear of this, right? But growing up in Southern California, I didn't have a lot of friends that were members of the church, right?
Yeah.
So my contrast was
not in
huge.
school, at least.
Yeah, definitely not in school. My contrast was huge. Like I had a lot. I feel like I had a harder time choosing between the two worlds to step into. But I also, because I had the example of non-member friends, I also saw more often what could happen by not following basic principles that are found within the gospel or gospel living or living a Christ-like life. I had a starker contrast. So with that, I was able to learn better, I think. Like having suffering, and that's why with dive school, I appreciate it more, and I learned more because I suffered more. I don't think I would have learned as much had I not suffered as much, because a lot of that suffering actually, like you said, it helped me develop my fears of not having oxygen when my brain says, hey, you need to surface. Well, over time of constantly being subject to that, over time I realized, well, actually, a little bit of this suffering can actually be quite enjoyable, which is kind of not a good thing. But and I was able to push myself a little bit further. And so there was times when I was diving where it's like, I am so glad that I had that suffering, because I know that this right now is not suffering, but I do know what it would be like to be in that fearful state, but I also know how to overcome that. And I think that it's the same thing with the plan of salvation and us being here. It's like the Holocaust, for example. Well, they had such a stark contrast, and that is unfortunate. And I don't think that God deems those things to happen. But when they pass on, they have a huge contrast to look at life, the lens of life through. And like you said, the progression doesn't stop there. And so that is evil, right? Like what happened to them was evil. But then there is also goodness. And there's also the opposite of that, which is what I'm assuming they're experiencing now, right? Well, we believe that they're experiencing now, if they choose it, right? So they still have their agency. Just because they were part of the Holocaust doesn't mean they're going to choose, they're going to choose God, right? Like not all of them are going to choose God, but I feel like the atonement can offset the suffering. And then at the end of the day, like, because we believe that God suffered in the garden, like he suffered everything. And it's such a unique position because to say it's unjust, well, it was also unjust for God to come down and suffer for everything. Like to suffer at all, really. Like why would he need to suffer if, like, I don't know, like what's your take on it from a Christian perspective? Like I honestly ask Christians that. Like, why did God need to die on the cross? And oftentimes they'll say, well, to fulfill prophecies. I'm like, okay, well, why? Why did he actually need to die on the cross? It's like,
that's a tough one. I think the Eastern Orthodox have a good one. They say they defeated evil, defeated death, right?
He defeated his own concepts that he came up with.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I think if you look at the Jesus on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? It's actually taken from a psalm. So if you look at the psalm, that was actually an Eastern Orthodox, Jonathan Pajot, that pointed this out, and it's from a psalm. And then if you go look at the psalm, the psalms are often lamentations. There's a lot of like, why is this suffering? Why is this happening? But if you read to the end of the psalm, it's a glorious thing that happens in the end. So it's turned into something great, and it's like it worked out in the end. And so I guess that is the kind of eschatological approach. Of course, in LDS scriptures, you read Joseph Smith has several sections on where he's suffering.
Yeah, 122 is when he's in the prison.
Yeah, God comes and tells, and basically, essentially, God resets his frame. Another part, he says, "Peace be unto you. This shall be but a small moment," right? Resetting, framed from into a small thing, and saying, oh, "Here's the eternal vision." Of course, the Moses 1 is an extreme version of that, where the small, I would never have thought man was so little when he'd experienced not the full glory of God, but because God says in that that you cannot experience full glory of God and remain, on the earth. So, but when you have such that large view of God, then of course these little things become less consequential. And I think that's the quote eternal perspective is kind of an LDS. The way of putting it is one way of doing with it. I don't think I always have a great answer for why a particular person gets relief from something and another person doesn't. I think that does fall into the mystery category to some degree. It's interesting that C.S. Lewis, who's often cited in General Conference, and it's not the evangelical I talk to who frequents LDS circles. He said, "Yeah, why is C.S. Lewis used so much? He seems to be your favorite author." Well, he's very ecumenical, and he's not out there, trying to destroy other denominations. He's mere Christianity, right? It's not my Christianity necessarily. But he had kind of the belief that real miracles, that he would term miracles, were very infrequent. So that they were general, instances, turning points in history. So he would be more, his thought would be that, something like the incarnation of Jesus, or, we in our frame would be the theophany of Joseph Smith, these kind of things, these transcendental moments where changes happen, and that his thought was that that a lot of the other things could be explained by natural forces. So, placebo effect, or other things that just turned in that direction that we attribute to miracles. And I'm not against attributing to miracles. I think anything that builds faith is not necessarily a bad thing, but it may be that there are just natural laws, like we believe, that are happening that work out in some person's favor and not in others, and that sometimes we may just see that as a miracle. And so it may be that the real instantiations of God truly intervening in the world are in a big major way are less than we think. Now, it's just his thought, because I think maybe he was wrestling with this issue. I don't think I have proof for that, but it seems that he's wrestling with, well, does God, if I can really make it so God is not intervening that much, truly, when it just, has to matter, otherwise the human race is in jeopardy, then and maybe that resolves a little of that question. And if a lot of the other things are kind of natural laws, then that would also be a partial explanation there.
And perhaps receiving a miracle like that is akin to receiving further light and knowledge, which we know that God's not going to grant to somebody who isn't going to act on it. And so perhaps those who receive miraculous things happen to them that truly can be categorized as miraculous, perhaps it's because they're prepared to act upon that further miraculous. Because even being healed miraculously, like, that should denote that there's some higher power, right? And so if there's a higher power, then I just need to act upon what I do know about that higher power. And so perhaps that is what's restricting miracles for some. It's their inability to want to act upon that further light knowledge. And to be frank, I'm going to say, like you do, in a sense, it's kind of mysterious because we don't have the peek behind the curtain to see how does it benefit somebody in mortality to be healed from an ailment. Like, how does it change their faith or shape their faith or shape their mortal experience? And for some that don't get healed miraculously, perhaps it's because they don't need much more out of mortality than what is offered. But we just don't know that. Like, we don't know based off the premortal existence and where they are on the progression and how much they actually need to get out of mortality. And that's kind of how I internally kind of deal with it. But with that, even that being said, I still believe that there's further chances upon death of still progressing and learning. And I don't think that we're just all of a sudden going to become like God, because even in the resurrection, like, I don't think that just because we're resurrected in a perfected body will necessitate that we are at God's level. Like, I don't think that those two, in my head at least, they don't square. And so I still think that there's a lot more to learn, and we have plenty of time to learn it. But what we always will have, and I'm thankful for, like, any amount of suffering that happens to me in mortality, I'm thankful for, because I know, just like my experience in dive school, that when I die, I can look back on that experience and say, that shaped me, mortality shaped me, and I learned a lot through my sins too. I learned a lot through my transgressions. I learned a lot through the repenting and relying upon God. I learned what it meant to receive a revelation from, like, the Holy Ghost. I learned what it's like to put off that revelation and just continue on my life and the repercussions of that. And so I have all of these experiences that I can draw upon. And to be honest, like, I do agree, like, maybe perhaps for a young infant who dies early on, perhaps they don't get to experience that suffering, which I would argue is perhaps to their detriment. Like, I don't think in the spirit world you get to learn as quickly. Mm-hmm. I think this such a short, it's a blip. It's a less than a blip in the grand scheme of the eternal perspective that you spoke of. But it is such an important time period to learn. It's much like 6 weeks, right? Or 7 years, 7, 8 years. 8 years for a lifetime of going back and looking at that experience and recalling that. And, so.
Yeah, I totally concur with all that. You know, there is the interesting part where Jesus talks about how he couldn't perform miracles in his own country, amongst his own people, because they
Yeah.
lacked the faith, right? They saw him
Yeah,
as, hey,
certainly.
just the guy I know down the street, right? I grew up with, right?
Yeah.
Um, you know, from a medical standpoint, if I was to look at that, I'd say, well, that's the placebo effect. They believe, so they have enhanced likelihood to get better if you believe. But you know, I'm not saying it's limited to that, but there is, you know, there are other explanations to why some people may be more open to having things happen, as you mentioned. You know, I think some of the Christian ways of critiquing LDS belief would be some of the things you highlighted, and that the belief that God does not have the omnipotence diminishes the sovereignty of God, right? And then the common thing you'll hear is that, well, is that God worthy of worship? And they'll throw that out, that the LDS God is not worthy of worship.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
can't be truly relied upon
A lesser
because
God.
is
Yeah.
lesser God, because he's not the foundation. He's not the cause of all being. He's just somebody that you can truly rely on to provide salvation. So that's a critique. I think another time to look into that, is that a valid one? I'm not so sure, but yeah, he says 2 weeks, stop evil, lesser, and so forth. So
Yeah.
I think that's some of the main ways. I mean, we've kind of peppered through LDS things. You know, I think you mentioned that a little child. I've heard in LDS circles that maybe that person was. I mean, some people have theorized that maybe they were so good in the pre-mortal life that they didn't need this experience. I kind of concur with you. It doesn't seem to make sense from the soul theodicy standpoint, in
Yeah.
that if this is an eternal development, of course, if you believe that there is development after life, then of course that doesn't, you know, that can make sense, but doesn't necessarily put that person further ahead. I'm not so sure. I think that's
I don't think it
uh,
does,
I
personally.
personally have never, you know, kind of jived with that view. I think the LDS answer to animal suffering, and that these are natural laws, go a long way to answering Alex O'Connor, you know, where he puts that out there. And most Christians, in my view, have they resort to, well, animals are really suffering. You know, uh, we're not sure how much pain and suffering they're actually having. Well, I just don't buy it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, being ripped to
If
shreds. I don't know,
Yeah,
on the
they
prairie.
look like they're trying to avoid it. You know, why would they
Yes.
avoid the predator if they're, you know, and if they hurt themselves or run into things, they're definitely learning from that mistake. They're not doing it again. You know,
Yeah.
why? Because they've got a painful response, much like we do. And so I guess you could also say that, you know, go the Calvinist approach, and that's another potential. Just, well, God just chose this for some, salvation for some, and some another. You know, that I think is a legitimate way of doing it. You know, now you may say that that makes you know, God in a different moral landscape than us. You know,
Yeah.
if we were just arbitrarily, like, I'm my four kids, pick two of them to be saved and two not, just out of my sovereignty and will. I don't. For me, that doesn't isn't an agapic entity, that in my view. But I guess it does. I definitely would say it does resolve a lot of the issues. You just say, well, God determined this. You know, you still have the question of why. You know, why would he do that if he is our model for following? Um, and so I think, you know, there are some questions about legitimate from people, why people suffer, why are they relieved from suffering and some others not. There's a mystery there, but you're right. Often that is going to be revealed to that person later in terms of their development and growth, and maybe beyond the grave. And so I think those are some of the interesting things. You know, now that leads me back. I think we can conclude on this: is what did Dostoevsky write as his response? Because he actually was dealing with this a lot and had his own doubts frequently. Um, I think this he brings in a subsequent chapter another person, a monk. So in Orthodoxy, Catholicism, monks are the the ultimate sacred person. Obviously we would differ. I tend to think that raising a family is dealing with kids and increasing your responsibility is in my mind harder. But obviously there's some aesthetic things that are hard about being a monk. But he brings his character Elder Zosima into the frame. And Elder Zosima is this, really loving, good monk that suffers through a lot of pain, but still is caring and loving and gracious to other people. And so he actually doesn't answer any of the questions of theism directly. What he says is that he brings this person who's just the epitome of Jesus, right? In terms of love and devotion and faith, and that who's has optimism and hope instead of skepticism. Is not living in nihilism, but has a good and cheerful humility and lives in prayer and so forth. And he's a guide. He's not simply just giving up on life and just do whatever whim comes to him, but he's growing and developing people around him, within his tutelage, and he's a mentor, and he's a symbol of hope and redemption, and an alternative vision to nihilism, where he has profound meaning and rooted in faith and love. And so he has a compelling thing that I often say that an atheist has a very difficult time coming up with a positive vision for life. What should you do? What meaning and purpose? Things that are building or make you do something in the morning. It's good. It's easy to break down other people's visions, but it's actually hard to put forth your own vision that you can stand by, right?
It truly is.
And most of them are like, well, if you test them on whatever vision they have, they can't really say, well, that's good for my well-being. I'm looking for the well-being of others, maximizing well-being. But they can't really justify that. They'll fall apart if they're really tested. Become their opinion or something like that. So essentially, I think the LDS provide more than Dostoevsky here, but I think that is part of the answer. We don't have all the answers to why it happens, but we can look at the lives of people that live in a certain way. And that is actually what that brought me back to the LDS Church, is that you don't always have, of course, the answers to every question you have. But when you look at the goodness and beauty and love of the people in the faith and the meaning and purpose they have, and how they care for each other, the community, and the practices and the rituals and the sacrifices they make, that is in a way an answer. It may not satisfy the atheist in a certain way that you've nailed every example they can come up with of the ultimate suffering and the ultimate injustice, and you can provide the answer they'll be satisfied with. Of course, they may not buy the LDS version of, we were here before and here and we're going. And so any answer you might give would be unsatisfying if it can't justify it in this life without all that stuff. But you can, in this sense, and this is, I would urge anybody to read this novel. When I read it, I was still in the atheist phase, so I thought, oh, wow, he couldn't come up with an answer. It's a sign of weakness. He had to point to the goodness and beauty of people that believe, right? But often, you're looking at the pragmatic results, and we often point to that in the LDS faith is what are the fruits, right? And often the fruits of a certain perspective are, if I was to offer something to somebody who's struggling, I can't always answer the questions. I can't always answer for myself 100%. I think there are some things that we in the LDS faith that do provide some answers, but I think in the end, if you look at the lives of, quote, saints, or the Latter-day Saints, in our view of people, that have this meaning and purpose and love and community and meaning through their tradition, Christian tradition, then you can say, well, that is an answer in a certain way. So any kind of thoughts on that or final thoughts?
No, I will say so much like Philip, I've had a lot of spiritual experiences. And so I do feel for those who fall into an atheistic mindset because they haven't themselves had profound spiritual experiences. But I will say how great your faith would have to be to have not had the experiences that I've had and yet still have enough of a particle of faith to live out this faith tradition. Like, and so for those who are struggling with their faith because they haven't had a profound spiritual experience, I will say, like, at the end of the day, if we both died tomorrow, I probably would have had an easier time living my faith than the other person would have, right? Who didn't have the same experiences. But just understand that, like, that's beautiful. Like, that's a beautiful thing at the end of the day, like, to say, like, hey, I didn't have all this additional help, or at least that I didn't recognize, and yet I still believed. And so, and I think that's like with Philip, like, who the one who doubted. It's like, well, what about all those people that never even saw me and yet still believed? Like, how great is their faith? And so I love it. But
yeah, I think that's great. And yeah, and I like that you brought up a particle of faith. Of course, you can, from a pragmatic standpoint, you can try things. Number one advice of this pastor Paul Vanderklay: just go to church, right? Even if you don't believe. In other words, do something, act, and see what the fruits of it are.
Yeah.
And even if you don't have that transcendent experience, I've never had a theophany experience or anything like that. And maybe that would be the great and terrible experience. It's usually the great and terrible day of the Lord, right? Both, it could be transcendently good and double-edged sword, as they say, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you might find, okay, well, maybe in some cases, you just go by, well, at the very least have good fruits that come from this, a better connection with family and my significant other and my kids, and I'm not just being self-absorbed and just constantly dwelling on my own problems. The Jordan Peterson has a good way of putting it. The suffering seems to be correlated with just thinking about yourself, right? So the amount you're thinking about yourself is the more you're suffering. So a church community is great. Obviously I feel at home in the LDS community, but any church community that I visited, where you're going out your side of yourself, you're thinking of other people, you're committed to serve, and maybe you're uncomfortable, you're putting, and then of course you're coming across people you don't get along with, really. So you're not just in your own tribe and your own silo, and the church is great for that, where you're meeting awkward people that catch
and
you outside.
Sometimes you are the awkward person.
Yeah, and sometimes you are the awkward person. So, I think that it's been excellent visiting with you. I know we've taken more time than you were allotted, probably double the time. But I think I've enjoyed visiting with you. I think there's lots of things we could talk about in the future in different areas, and build kind of more LDS channels like you created, where these kind of interesting conversations can happen that aren't just strictly, hey, we're trying to defend our boundary maintenance. Is often how I hear. We're setting down our LDS boundaries versus your boundaries and this kind of thing, and where we can kind of transcend, have communion essentially among many people of different walks. So, but also still, and not necessarily that we were going to give up our own beliefs and throw them all out at the expense of ecumenical discussions. But thank you very much for having me
awesome
on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on with me. And of course, if for all of you watching, this is going to be on both of our channels, and so I didn't think it would be right to really introduce it as me speaking with him on my channel, and I don't think so, but either way, it'll be on both of our channels, hopefully. So I'll send you this link, and we'll, until next time. Yeah. Hopefully you jump on Adam's full. Actually, it's, I'm not sure if they can see the name when you output.
I think it
goes away.
I don't know.
But
Yeah.
either way, I'll drop a link in the description of Adam's channel, and I think you'll find it definitely is. It's definitely a lot different than my content. I will say that.
Yeah.
Because you delve into a different group and subset of uh, people and how they think, and so yeah, I think that those who follow my channel might find the channels that you've spoken of and that you kind of maybe not necessarily promote. I'd say they'll find them to be quite enjoyable and interesting. So, well, thanks, Adam, for speaking with me, and I guess we'll see you next time.
Yeah. Have a good night. Good evening.
You too. Okay, so the reason why I decided to do Through the Mist was actually because I like these conversations. I like conversations like this. I like talking to Christians.
Me too.
Mostly Protestant and evangelical. I haven't spoken with a lot of Catholic Christians, and what I've noticed is oftentimes like the Catholics I have ran into, I like in like the workplace and whatnot. They oftentimes like don't want to talk about faith often, and that just might be like a byproduct of being in the military, right? Like that's like the demographic of religious folk that I'm speaking with, and so
Yeah.
but yeah, I like talking about religion, theology, and then also I've noticed that there's a lot of like varying opinions on what we believe online, and so I like to speak with Christians and kind of see what they believe in lieu of what they understand in lieu of what they believe, and so how that affects like their worship with God, and so kind of reflecting. My hope is like through interviews with Christians, I can kind of reflect what good dialogue might look like, and so that's my hopes with the channel. But
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, like, and I've said this on multiple other channels, like, it is almost like a selfish endeavor because I really do like having these conversations, and so like
you get some joy out of it.
Having a channel like this kind of like lets me have an in to ask people to have a conversation, where otherwise it would just be like, yeah, I'd rather not have a conversation with you. It's like, well, I have this channel and, we could talk about it on the channel, but it's really selfish. I just really want to talk about theology and stuff. So
that's kind of me too. So, I kind of went through a quote deconstruction phase, years ago during the new atheist period, late 2000s. And it was kind of out of the church for a while. I did baptize a couple of my sons. And then I kind of came across Jordan Peterson. A lot of guys kind of did. And that his Bible series kind of reawakened something in me. It was kind of, wow, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Especially the psychological take. I'm in the medical profession, but even then, I wasn't. I hadn't thought of it in that way. And there was a Christian pastor who's really influenced me. His name is Paul Vanderklay, and he did tons of commentary on Jordan Peterson. And so it was kind of just algo served his channel up to me. And then I started following his content. And then a gentleman named Jonathan Peugeot, who's an Orthodox Christian icon carver, which Jordan Peterson collaborates a lot with. They've had a lot of conversations, and they've done a bunch of biblical series together. And so, there's this pastor who formed this he didn't form this community, but this community formed around him called the Little Corner. It's kind of an interesting name. And it's all these Christian, even Jewish, but Christians of all flavors, Orthodox, tons of Catholics, tons of Protestants of every variety. And they have this kind of constellation of channels. And I've been kind of involved in that for several years, kind of as a lurker, commenter, and, I decided, well, at some point, there wasn't much LDS representation. There were a few LDS people. I was one of them, but most of us were just kind of occasional commenters. And I decided at some point that, I kind of was coming back to church, that maybe I ought to be involved in that community in a more open way, show my face actually, right? And not just and create some videos. And then your channel kind of just got served up, from YouTube. So I noticed you and a few other channels are more kind of conversing with thinkers from different denominations, and it's not just straight apologetics. So
yeah,
I myself am not interested in just battling apologetics. I know there's channels that do that, and
yeah,
they're doing a good job at it. I think so. New channels, relatively. I think there's some LDS people actually taking that on, doing a very good job of it. But for me, I'm more interested in just having, kind of like you're saying, those great conversations and dialogue, and see where there's a lot of connections. So surprisingly, there's a lot of ways in which maybe we speak different words, but there's a lot of connections in these communities. So, and the quote little corner is the very open. So they don't mind having LDS people there discussing, talking with them. I had a conversation with evangelical, which I'll have on my channel tomorrow, who's I met, and so very nice, and so that's been really fruitful. So that's kind of how I decided very recently to finally start doing a channel, and then I saw your various interactions with a lot of different people, Christians. So thought maybe I need to get some interactions with some LDS people too that are a little more open to that kind of conversation, and perhaps they could also be involved with some of these figures. You might notice some of these people I've even met even in the little corners biblical Unitarians, which I never had heard of before. So and they're kind of apologists for that, and they're very open. So it's very interesting. But you may be able to connect to some of those people if you're interested in getting like a biblical Unitarian take on Christology and stuff.
That'd be pretty cool.
Kind of an interesting conversation. And so, but I know the purpose, kind of what we were thinking through tons of different topics I could talk about is kind of when you ruminate on things for years, you don't really talk about it much. You have lots of different thoughts on things, and